Da-da. Okay. Hi. My name's Chris Carlson. I retired in roughly 2022. I was a genetic epidemiologist, and 2020 was a very long year for those of us who are epidemiologists. Um, and since then, I've been taking up new hobbies, which I had a PhD in genetics. I had been working at the Fred Hutch's, their local cancer center. I'm the co-founder of a biotechnology company here in Seattle. And many of you have a spark bird. I have a damper bird. If there had ever once been a barn owl in that stupid barn, my dad dragged me to look at it 4:30 in the morning, every Christmas count when it was freezing out. I might have been interested in birding. As it was, I didn't pick up birding until my last child quit playing soccer, and I realized I had all this equipment for shooting photos and didn't know what to do with myself. So, sorry. I guess in 2021 I retired, and my father, who is a crazy birder, in 2021 my mother retired from chaperoning him on international trips. So I took over, and that's kind of how I got back into birding at post 50. And in looking around to try and figure out what I was going to do with myself, I have always been a fan of hummingbirds, and I decided, it would be fun to try and see every hummingbird species. Which has one advantage, having been on a couple of trips to Uganda and Papua New Guinea and New Zealand, I've discovered that the Americas have one huge advantage over everything else, and that is that they're within six time zones, which makes it a whole lot easier for me to travel to them and not feel utterly miserable. So, within the Americas, hummingbirds are restricted to the Americas. As an American, you don't realize how lucky you are. The Europeans, the Asians, and the Africans, they're out of luck. No hummingbirds in any of the other continents, just North and South America. So if I was going to see every hummingbird, I had to ask myself how many species actually exist. Well, it turns out the answer to that question is a much harder question to answer than you'd expect. Um, and sorry, as I'm going, Sal, I, I can't simultaneously give a talk and monitor the questions list. So if something does come up, go ahead and try to break my train of consciousness. I'm just going to keep giving the talk until you wave your hand.
Okay.
Um, but it's all right. I mean, my goal here tonight is for everybody to learn something about hummingbirds that they've never known before. So the first part is evolution. How many hummingbird species are out there? Well, a couple of years ago, actually a little bit more than a decade ago, Jimmy McGuire and a team of other scientists down at Berkeley and other departments across the U.S. got together and published a remarkable paper where what they did was they got DNA samples from almost two-thirds of the species of hummingbirds on the planet. That is, they had, and from multiple individuals from many of those species, which they were then able to sequence. Sequencing DNA is what I do. When you sequence DNA, you can build a tree. This is a tree relating every species of hummingbird on the planet to every other species that they got DNA from. The most recent common ancestor over here in red. So when you're looking at a tree like this, the x-axis is time. So this is going back 22 million years ago. There's one species of hummingbird on the planet that has then radiated into 300, which are the tips of the leaves over here on the right side of that graph. Most of that radiation has occurred in the last 5 million years. That is, there are a whole lot of species that are new, and there are things like the bees, which we'll get into, where that entire group of hummingbirds, there's 20 something species of bee, all of them were one species no more than 6 million years ago. So evolution is still working very hard at making hummingbirds and making more hummingbirds. This most recent common ancestor was about 22 million years ago, almost certainly in South America. And the important point about this is that it was probably a marginally successful species doing something in the swamps of South America when the Andes started to rise. And the coincidence of the radiation of hummingbirds, the spectacular radiation evolutionarily of the hummingbirds, and the rise of the Andes is not random. As the mountains rose, the temperature gradients, the environmental biomes available diversified dramatically. And it turns out that although insects are fantastic for pollination, once things get cold enough, you have a problem. Cold and rainy enough, it actually becomes advantageous to have a warm-blooded pollinator. And that's where, as these mountains rose, the hummingbirds took over pollination of many of the plants in particular biomes. So operationally, hummingbirds, that's the English term that has become dominant. A more technically accurate term for them is hoverbirds. That is, they're humming. There are other birds that can make a humming noise. These guys are the only ones that can hover in place. So, on a normal bird, you have a downstroke where they're generating some lift, and an upstroke where they're just trying to claw their way into the sky. They're not doing anything. Hummingbirds move their wings forward and back 10, 8 to 12 times per second. So these wing beats on the forward swipe, they're pushing air down. And on the back swipe, their wing turns over and also generates lift. These are the only birds that are generating lifts on both the forward and backward stroke of their wings. There are other birds that can hover, like the osprey, the kingfisher, some of the kestrels, but they look like they're working really hard. These guys don't. And so, how did this one group of birds come up with a way to do this unique style of flight? The key to that is it's the shoulder. The shoulder joint is how we recognized in the scientific community the first fossil of a hummingbird, where when they were going through this smooshed little platform of hummingbird, um, let's see, sorry, I've got this, there, I'm gonna move that over there. Perfect. Up here indicated in red is actually the key joint. It's the supracoracoideus. And in the shoulder joint, what they did was they developed a particular muscle more spectacularly than any other bird, allowing them to, most birds, the breast, the forward stroke is 90% of the muscle mass, and maybe 10% is involved in pulling the wings back. As a matter of fact, in many cases, that 10% coming back isn't used at all because it's really, you just let the wings lift themselves as you pass through the air. For hummingbirds, they're actually on the backstroke. They're pulling almost as hard as they're pulling on the forward stroke. And that requires some interesting rewiring of the skeleton. Now, the interesting thing about this particular skeleton that they found is that it's 30 million years ago. And since we know that the first hummingbird, the most recent common ancestor of the hummingbirds, was in South America, you might expect that this should be a bird that's in South America. And that first fossil that we have at this point actually comes out of Germany. How did hummingbird get from Germany to South America in 8 million years? So 30 million years ago, we got our first fossil with the right shoulder joint. The answer is probably that they didn't get from Germany to South America. They were probably already in both places. We just have exceptionally well-developed fossil beds being researched in the right era in Germany. This is the lamppost phenomenon where you find things where you're looking for them very hard. All right, so I won't go down that rabbit hole too much further, but the important point is that they've got this special joint in their wing, and that wing beat rate, the wing is actually operating as a spring, basically. This is a really cool piece of data from Crawford Greenwalt back in 1960, where if you measure the wing length and you measure it against the wing beat rate, there's a linear correlation between them. Longer wings beat more slowly, shorter wings beat more rapidly. And the fun thing that you probably don't know about hummingbirds is that any given hummingbird, when it starts its wings up, it doesn't vary the rate at which it beats its wings. It can vary how it feathers its wings. It can vary other things, but it basically their wings are on or off for their beating. And that's probably because a lot of the beat rate is possibly faster than their nervous system can send signals to it. So we know this for bumblebees. I suspect it's true for hummingbirds too. Bumblebee muscles involved in beating their wings beat faster than nerves can repolarize. So bumblebee muscles for their wings actually will beat 4 or 5 times per impulse they get from the nerves telling them to beat. They beat faster than the nerves can transmit information. Anyway, so on the hummingbird side, the smaller guys, so the amethyst woodstar, it actually sounds very much like a bumblebee when it comes over your shoulder. It kind of freaks you out if one of those guys flies past you. The giant hummingbird, which is it's actually the size of a sparrow, more or less. It beats at 10 hertz, which is slightly below what humans perceive as a tone. So you can actually hear each individual beat of that wing, 10 per second, and when it's flying near you, which is pretty cool stuff too. Now, hummingbirds, as I mentioned earlier, they co-evolved with plants, and the advantage to the plants is that they have a warm-blooded pollinator that can operate in cold temperatures, and they can also operate when it's raining out. Um, the general mechanism is that the flower is going to have some sort of a corolla, a tube that you're going to stick your schnoz into to get at the nectar. And outside of that, it's going to have some anthers for depositing pollen onto the forehead of the bird or onto the beak of the bird. And so the transfer of pollen from flower to flower is the advantage to the flower, to the plant. The advantage to the birds is that the plants, well, the birds aren't just doing this for fun, they're doing it to get nectar. So the plants generate nectar specifically to lure birds in so that they can put pollen onto them. Here on the right, a swallow-tailed hummingbird down in Brazil does not have a yellow beak. That is a beak that is 100% coated with pollen from the local plants that he's been eating from. And it's not unusual to have strange patches of color on hummingbirds when you're visiting places where you look at them and then you realize later, oh, that was all pollen that had been accrued onto that bird's beak or forehead, or even other interesting places on their body. Um, so the one of the legends is that hummingbirds like red. They prefer the color red. While it is true that hummingbirds can see the color red, hummingbirds are not dumb. Any plant that provides a reasonable bonus in terms of how much nectar it provides is going to be visited by hummingbirds. So we've got pictures. I've seen them feeding from purple, pink, white, uh, orange, blue, any color of the rainbow. Hummingbirds will visit it if it's got enough pollen in it. And the other thing that's actually kind of meaningful in this is that the uh, many of us had heard in the lay literature that hummingbirds bills match the flowers that they visit. That is only true for a very small number of hummingbirds. So the sword-billed hummingbird here has the longest bill proportional to body length of any bird on the planet. This guy is indeed specifically adapted to access a very specific set of flowers. So the flowers, Brugmansia and Passiflora mixta, have these extremely long corollas, which are like a lock and key mechanism where the bill fits into these long flowers, where that's the only way to get at the nectar. Now, why do these particular flowers go with this? It sort of winds up being an interesting arms race in the jungle down in South America because you have a lot of different plants competing to be fertilized by these pollinators. And if you are a plant that has a long distance between your blossoms, that is, if you've got one plant and the next plant is a half a kilometer away, having a lock and key mechanism so that only one species can feed from you is a good idea because that way that same species has a big advantage. They'll hit one, they'll remember where that is, and they'll go over and they'll hit the next one. It'll be full of nectar so that you can actually get transfer of pollen a long way in the rainforest. That said, the vast majority of hummingbirds are generalists, where they will feed from anything where their bill is long enough to get at the nectar, and sometimes even when it isn't long enough to get at the nectar. So the hummingbird tongue is a fascinating thing. And here's a fawn-breasted brilliant that I caught sticking his tongue out. They do this a lot after they've been feeding. They'll just perch and they'll sort of slurp off their tongues. When they extend their tongue into a flower, the tongue has this pincher sort of appearance to it. This is from back in 1830 when René Lesson was doing his first book on hummingbirds. And the original and very wrong theory for the forked tongue was that they were using it to catch insects inside of flowers. That's not true. The second theory on the tongues was that they were actually tubular and they were using them as a straw to suck nectar out of flowers. That is also incorrect. What this long tongue is doing is it's acting through capillary action, where the tongue is extended out of the beak into the nectary, and this is done 10 times a second. It's a very fast, it's like your cat lapping up milk from a bowl. Each time the tongue goes out, it catches a little bit of liquid, pulls it back into the beak. The beak and the tongue are structured in such a way that it actually gets squeezed back out. It swallows, and then the tongue goes back out to get the next bit of nectar. And it will keep doing that in a natural flower until the nectary is empty, until that flower has been drained. In hummingbird feeders, that would never happen. In theory, the hummingbird could literally sit there and just keep drinking until it was full. In practice, their evolution has not programmed them to do that yet. But eventually, I imagine that our local feeder dependent hummingbirds will start getting to the point where they'll just sit at the feeder, they'll top up completely, and they won't bother looking for the next flower. All right. Now, flowers aren't the only thing that hummingbirds eat. So hummingbirds will also take rotten fruit. And this is one where part of actually, the reason I'm giving this talk is that Jim Gaines had a picture that I found in the Macaulay Library. There were some behaviors that we all know happen. They're real, and yet they're very, very hard to catch in the act. This is one of them. The rufous hummingbird on the right, Greg Thompson caught it feeding from sapsucker wells. And all of us in the Northwest know that our local hummingbirds show up at just about the same time as the sapsuckers, and we know that they do feed from sapsucker wells. And yet, in 4 years of trying to catch one, of actually looking for this behavior, I have failed to ever see it, much less photograph it. So it's not a common behavior. But it is something where, interestingly, I finally have realized this year I was probably looking at the wrong time. So the sapsuckers show up literally at the same time as the males migrate in up here. And the theory I had been operating under was that these males didn't have access to flowers. Well, actually, that's not true. The earliest blooming flowers up here are salmonberry. The salmonberry open at exactly the same time that the rufous arrive. And therefore, they've got access to floral nectar when they show up. The pictures, when I went into into the Macaulay Library of this behavior, are very much concentrated in May when and they are actually more likely to be female than male feeding from the sapsucker wells. And my working hypothesis here is that these are females who are feeding nestlings and they are gleaning bugs while simultaneously getting the sap. It's sort of a twofer that you need protein to build a baby. And nectar has this problem. It's only got carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in it. It doesn't have phosphorus, nitrogen, or sulfur, which are the other three key elements that you need to build proteins and to build a baby bird. So when they are in the nest, the nestlings absolutely need more of the non-nectar part of the diet than the adult hummingbirds do. All right, which brings me to how do they catch bugs? Well, there are two major behaviors for bugs. The first on the left is fly catching. And sometimes in the afternoons, you'll see a hummingbird that's perched at a high point and it'll be zipping out 5 or 6 feet and then going back to his perch. And what you didn't see was, I mean, in thousands of pictures I've taken of this, is the only time I actually got the midge in focus. They're not taking flies, they're taking those little tiny no-see-um gnats. And the fun part about it is you can really see how wide this guy is gaping in order to catch that gnat. They don't catch them like a pair of chopsticks. They catch them like a flycatcher. The bug goes straight down the gullet. So they've got to hit it accurately. The other way that they get protein into their diet is by gleaning from foliage. They're looking around, and here I caught an Anna's female, and she's about to glean the spider off of that plant. And so they do, the females, particularly when the females are feeding nestlings and fledglings, they will do a lot of gleaning behavior. So, which brings me to breeding and rearing of young. So, the hummingbirds, well, we'll get to the males. For now, let's just go with the fact that when it comes to raising babies, the male hummingbird is useless. And the female is in charge of making the nest, laying the eggs, brooding the eggs, feeding the nestlings, feeding the fledglings, and moving on with her life. The male is responsible for providing some sperm. That's all. So here on the left, we've got a female rufous who's about to feed a fledgling who's gotten, she will actually continue to feed them after they've fledged from the nest for a week or so. And on the right is a fledgling Anna's hummingbird. The funny part about fledging of hummingbirds is that when they leave the nest, these little guys are absolutely capable of flight. What they haven't figured out yet is landing. So if you ever have the pleasure of watching one of these events happen, you'll see the little guys and they will find a stick and they will try to land on it. And the first 4 or 5 times that they try, they will miss. And in the case of the one that I have the picture of on the right, this little guy tried to land on this stick several times, missed it, and wound up head over tail in the shrub below before he managed to fly back up and try to perch on it again. He eventually got the knack of it, but it's clearly landing is much harder than flying for these guys. Now, let's get back to the males. The thing about hummingbirds that draws many of us to them isn't their lifestyle, it's they're beautiful little birds. They're some of the most spectacular examples of male-female dimorphism. So, in order to participate in the species, the first thing that males do is try to look fabulous. About two-thirds of hummingbird species are dimorphic sexually, where the female and the male are easily resolved. This guy here on the left is a marvelous spatule tail. It's a highly endangered hummingbird down in Peru and should be on everybody's bucket list. This is the same guy trying to woo the females. The female here has longer tail than your average hummingbird. She's a spectacular bird in her own right, but she doesn't have these tail feathers that are 3 times the length of the rest of her body. Um, but so the males look good to advertise their fitness for breeding, and they will have a whole lot of different breeding behaviors. The hummingbirds that get up here to us, the Rufus, the Allens, and the Annas, all three of those have dive displays. If you've never noticed the dive display, you should go into the eBird and listen to the dive displays for those guys, because they are one of the sounds of spring that you probably have never realized is a hummingbird. And when you catch them doing it, what they're doing is they're flying up about 50 yards, diving down to about 10 yards off the deck, and pulling up at about 60 miles an hour. They're not just falling, they are flying downward. And when they hit the bottom, they snap their tail open, and their tail feathers act like a reed instrument. It's not a vocalization, it's actually the tail feathers being strummed by the wind. So controlling territory is another thing that males do. So they show up early, usually in migratory hummingbirds. Anna's isn't migratory, but for the Rufus hummingbirds up here, we get the males 2 weeks before we get the females. The males show up to establish who owns the good territories, and then the females show up. And once the females show up, or if you're in an area where the females are always there, one of the other things that hummingbirds will do is sing beautifully. Now, this is a highly sarcastic label. They will sing enthusiastically, but nobody who has ever heard a hummingbird sing can properly describe it as beautiful. Here we have the Margretta's Hermit. The Margretta's Hermit's song is a single note, and it appears that what proves his fitness as an exceptional male is how many times in a row he can repeat that note. So if you've got one of these guys singing above your cabin down in Costa Rica, you will perhaps have 30 minutes to 45 minutes of a single note being repeated. Beep, 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 beep. It is like having a car alarm go off, and it's rather annoying after the first 10 minutes. All right. So, but as I was mentioning, I got ahead of myself on the dive displays. The dive display, those of us up here in North America are familiar with it, but most hummingbirds do not do this. This is really limited to the bee clade of hummingbirds. And when you look at the Anna's hummingbird who's stretching his tail here, this is a funny shaped tail feather, this R5. And that's acting like the reed on a reed instrument. And when he's flying down from high up, when he gets to the bottom of it here, all of a sudden he snaps his tail open, and the tail stays open until it closes again. And this section where he's got his tail spread is when you get there's a zing noise for the Anna's hummingbird. For the Rufus hummingbird, it does something similar, only it opens its tail 5 times. And so it's opening its tail each of those times as it zips through the bottom of its J arc. And it's doing 50 to 60 miles an hour in order to make that reed really sing. Fun thing about it, the actual shape of the feather and which of the 5 rectrices on the tail feather is the one making the noise has changed over time from the calliope, where it's mostly rectrices 1, 2, and 3. Here in the Anna, it's rectrix 5, so it's the outermost. But you've got these movements where Allen's is Sassine. Sassine here is the 2 and 3, so it's the middle-ish ones. And these are the ones where when you're actually reading through the guidebooks, they're utterly useless, trying to tell you how to tell the difference between an Allen's and a Rufus male. The answer is rectrices 2 and 3. The shape of those two changes the sound that they make during their dive display. Other than that, these birds are almost indistinguishable in the field. How much green you have on the back, yes. But I have observed Rufus up here with significant green, and I've seen Allens with less greens than some of the Rufus I've seen. So they're just hard to tell. But it's this really cool thing where back in, this is less than 20 years old, this research. And it's just been moving around and tuning and exactly which pair. And some of them, it's actually a pair of feathers. Let me see. I think it's Costa's, where 4 and 5 actually interfere with each other. So you get a pair of feathers vibrating at slightly different frequencies. Anyway, great fun stuff. And here's the Rufus. And here on the Rufus, so it's 2 and 3. So this is 2 and 3. Those two are the feathers that are vibrating to generate their music when they do their dive display. All right. So moving on from the males, the feeding tactics of hummingbirds. Oh gosh, no, it's only 7:28, so we're doing fine. Um, so feeding tactics. On it, most people are familiar with normal hover feeding. So hover feeding is when the bird is hovering and it's going to stick its schnoz all the way up through the corolla into the nectar and lap up the nectar. What are you to do if your bill's not long enough? This is the same flower being fed on by a much smaller hummingbird with a much shorter bill. This is known as flower piercing, and there are actually entire families of birds known as flower piercers. But in the hummingbirds, there are many, if not most, hummingbirds where they have shorter bills who actually are also flower piercers. So if they come up against a flower that's too long for them, they're just going to bypass that and go right in at the base and try and get through it to get their tongue into the nectary. What's great about this for the hummingbird is he's got access to more food. What's bad about this for the plant is if you look at this bottom one, you can see that she's getting pollen on her from the anthers on this fuchsia. This guy is nowhere near the anthers of that fuchsia. The flower is being robbed of nectar without the benefit of distributing its pollen. So most flowers will defend their corolla, defend their nectary by putting stronger stuff around it. It's not easy to nectar pierce on most of the flowers. Interestingly, there's another one where sometimes when you are flower piercing, this is a long-tailed sylph, and it is actually hanging onto the anther with its feet. It's not getting pollen on its forehead, it's getting pollen on its butt, which actually might partially explain not only the long-tailed sylph, but there's an entire subfamily of hummingbirds known as puff legs, where they have these fluffy little trousers around their legs, and they all have relatively short bills. I suspect that they are probably cling feeders, where the flowers that they've co-evolved with expect to be flower pierced, but have got anthers that allow them to hold on to the anthers with their feet while they're feeding. So it's less energy than hover feeding. In hover feeding, you're beating your wings. In cling feeding, you're not necessarily even beating your wings at all. Another thing that they will do is a lot of hummingbirds have straight bills. A large number of them also have curved bills. Some of the curves fit the flowers, but sometimes you wind up with these spectacular cases. This is a Planalto hermit who has turned its head almost entirely upside down so that the curve of its bill actually fits this particular flower that it's feeding off of. And that's something that it's not a great picture, but it's a very hard picture to take. I've only seen one other picture like it. And it brings this feature of the anatomy of a hummingbird. Most of us don't realize that hummingbirds have a really long neck. And that's something where you take the feathers off of a hummingbird. This little guy, if you look at it, if you had to guess at which species we were looking at, you probably wouldn't say, oh, this is obviously an Allen's hummingbird. That's an Allen's hummingbird after you've taken off all the feathers. And it's got a really long neck. And what that allows it to do is the neck can be adjusted so that the body might jostle relative to the flower. The flower might blow in the wind a little bit, but that neck allows it to keep the beak perfectly in time with the flower while the body is doing the flying behind it, which is really cool stuff. And it also makes it this incredibly flexible thing that allows hummingbirds to turn their heads almost entirely upside down if they really want to. It also explains some of the very earliest pictures that European explorers brought back. So back in 1640, a guy by the name of Georg Markgraves is in Brazil, near Recife, and he's been sent down there by the Dutch West Indies Company, and he's drawing pictures of hummingbirds. This guy is the greatest early naturalist that you've never heard of, because he's doing this around 1644, and on his way back home, he dies of malaria. But his drawings were rediscovered in Krakow, Poland, of all things, in 1977. That he had brought them back. They'd been given to his superiors in the Dutch West Indies Company. And this hummingbird, no one would recognize. You would look at this and think this is a tern. This is actually a drawing of a swallow-tailed hummingbird. And the reason it has such a funny neck is that it's a drawing from a dead swallow-tailed hummingbird where it's relaxed its neck. And when he's trying to perch that, that's what it looked like to him. So all hummingbirds have these long necks. They're just invisible to us because they're being used by the birds in ways that are generally hiding the neck from us. Now let's talk briefly about feeding strategies. Heck. You know what? Yeah, I'm going to do feeding strategies and then I'll pause and maybe we'll schedule another time to keep going on the nest. But the strategies here is something that we up here in North America are really only familiar with one kind of hummingbird, and that's the aggressive guys who guard their resources enthusiastically. Anybody who has a feeder in their backyard knows that you put it up and the rufous arrived and just chases everyone else away. That's perfectly normal, but it's only one strategy that hummingbirds have. So here, the Talamanca hummingbird in the background is indeed one of these resource hoarders. But in most areas where they've got multiple species, you'll have big hummingbirds, medium-sized hummingbirds, smaller hummingbirds. The fiery-throated hummingbird is what's known as a filcher, where he tries to steal nectar from the resources being guarded by this guy, and has a very funny behavior where it hides inside of the shrub of many flowers, hoping that the big hummingbird doesn't notice it, and then he comes out when he's not looking and steals a little bit of nectar. Hummingbirds hate other hummingbirds, whether they're their own species or another species. They're highly, highly competitive. But there is another way to live. So there's a group of hummingbirds known as the hermits, where they are the guys who are really adapted to the heliconia flowers that are a long way apart, very rich flowers when they're blooming. And so these guys have what's known as a trapline strategy, where they'll hit one flower, drain it, and then they'll keep going. They'll find another flower 5 minutes, 50 yards down the way, and they'll just fly in a circle going from one flower to another. And about every half hour, they come back through on their circuit to the same flower that's now replenished its nectar that keeps these guys going on their trap line. They don't fight over any one flower. They just keep going to the next one and to the next one. The last strategy that's really fun and easy to see in South America is bees are competitors with hummingbirds for nectar, for flower access. And all hummingbirds treat bees with extraordinary respect. Even the smallest bee will scare a hummingbird away from a feeder because a single sting is lethal to a hummingbird. There is one group of hummingbirds that have actually figured out how to take advantage of this, and these are the bees, where the coquettes and the wood stars have gotten so small that these guys fly like a bee. They hold their bodies more horizontal than other hummingbirds. They don't do the big swooping that other hummingbirds do. They fly more in straight lines, stop, and then they angle in like little helicopters. And they're so small that they even sound like big bumblebees, with the consequence that other hummingbirds treat them as bees. They're not going to chase them away. This sparkling violet ear is about to have a great battle with the bronzy Inca. But over on the other side of the feeder, you got a couple of wood stars that nobody's going to bother touching because they think they're bees. So if you fake your behavior to be like a bee, everyone gives you the respect that the bees get in the first place. All right. Let's see, what time is it? Oh, it's only 7:35. Okay. We'll keep going a little bit longer and we'll see how far we get on this. So here on the left is one of the puff legs that I mentioned. There are only really 4 types of feather on a hummingbird. You've got the primary. Yeah, go ahead.
Are you going to get to the nests?
I can actually blow through molting to the nests, which I think is my next topic. We'll skip over these guys.
A little bit of the nest would be nice.
Yeah. Well, okay. So the first thing I actually wanted to point out is that within the clades of hummingbirds, there's large groupings of hummingbirds. There are subfamilies that are more similar, and they've been known as emeralds, the bees, which are the ones with the dive displays, the coquettes, the brilliants, the mangoes. Hermits were thought to be the most primitive of hummingbirds, but when they did this study, there was this group out here that they called the topazes, which is really kind of interesting. The topazes are actually 4 species. There are the Jacobins, the white-necked Jacobin, and the black Jacobin. And then there's the fiery topaz and the crimson topaz. And these 4 were grouped into what was called the topazes by McGuire et al. This is the only mistake that they made in that paper, because the Jacobins are 5 million years apart from each other. That's basically the same distance as any of our bees, the Allen's hummingbird to the Anna's hummingbird, 5 million years. The topazes are 3 million years apart, but the topazes to the Jacobins, that's 18 million years. The reason I want to talk about that is the Jacobins have a fascinating nest, which means that we got to talk about nests. Most hummingbird nests look like half a walnut. And the ones you'll be familiar with will generally have lichen on the outside. That's the usual camouflage material. What they're usually constructed as is you've got a layer of an internal layer that's sort of soft, fluffy stuff. That's usually some sort of a fiber from a plant. Outer layers and structural stuff, and it's all held together with spider webs. Now, this is why I'm giving you the talk, because Jim Gain got this picture of a band-tailed barbed-throat actually stealing the silk from a spider web to build her nest. This is a picture that I've been trying to take for 6 years. It is not a picture you take on purpose. You take it by being ready and getting lucky. And Jim got very, very lucky, and I'm very happy for him. So once they've stolen that, this is a picture that I actually took. And if you look very carefully, she's got a piece of spider silk where she is pulling down one of the fronds off of this palm leaf and is starting her nest by getting that spider silk stuck to the nest, not her bill. Once she's got it stuck to that nest, she's going to keep wrapping and adding stuff on. This is actually a hummingbird in a nest. So this is known as a type 1 nest. Type 1 nests really just look like a really bad a really bad cobweb, to be honest. And you can actually see through them. That is, if the bird's not in the nest and there are eggs in the nest, you can see the eggs through the nest. They're just held, it's sort of fibrous material held together with spider webs, and that's all. And the reason that type 1 nests are used by a particular subset of hummingbirds is that these are hummingbirds that live in extraordinary wet places. When you have a downpour in these jungles, it's snorkel weather. You're going to spend hours drying out. These nests dry out in a matter of minutes because the water flows right through them. So the type 1 nests are really fine. The type 2 nests look a lot like a type 1 nest, but they've added the internal fluffy stuff. So here's a type 1, no adornment. The type 2, you can see that there's all this nice stuff in there to keep the nestlings warm and protected. So that was when about 70 years ago, Augusto Ruschi came up with these as the typing of nests. The type 3 nest is the one we're more familiar with because the type 1 and 2 nests are really only tropical hummingbirds. Type 3 looks more like a cup. And they come in flavors where some of them are unadorned. For island species, they frequently won't have any lichen or other camouflage on the outside. For species on the mainland, they might be adorned or camouflaged with lichen or other dead material, moss. Here's a mesquite disguised nest from a broad-billed hummingbird in Arizona. But there are a few nests that don't seem to really fit in any of the other categories. So these are the topaz nests. So first, the topazes have these interesting ones. And I want to point out, this one is not one nest. This is a female who's returned to the same site. There was a previous year she raised a nest here, and she built her new nest on top of the old nest. This is not an unusual behavior. Hummingbirds will live in the wild. If they make it through their first year, they'll live for 5 or 6 years. And females who have a successful clutch will usually return to the same site to try and raise the next season. So you can get as many as 4 or 5 of these nests stacked on top of each other. The topaz nest, in contrast to the Jacobin nest, the Jacobins are these were grouped by McGuire et al. The birds themselves look similar. They've got a similar shape, but the nests are nothing at all alike. And the Jacobin nests are absolutely unique. They're these weird little things that are placed on top of a leaf near the petiole, near where the leaf connects to the stem. And they're not adorned with anything. They look like little cotton balls that they're sitting on. I can't tell you why, but they really do look like nothing else. The one thing I can tell you is if you missed it, you should look for, there was a very recent paper published on the white-necked Jacobin where their hatchlings, the natal down on those hatchlings looks like this white stuff. And when they feel threatened, they rear up as if they are a particularly nasty kind of caterpillar that most things don't want to eat. They look like woolly bear caterpillars. So I think that might be what's going on with these guys, but these two have very similar nest structures, and they're unlike any nest, any other hummingbird. And the important thing to remember on nest is they don't learn how to make the nest from their mother. Mom makes the nest, the babies are born in it. When they return to that area to raise their own kids about a year later, the female hummingbirds, how they make this nest is absolutely genetic. They know how to do it. They're hardwired as a behavior to make a nest that has particular components in it, uses particular types of camouflage, and is placed in a particular place on the plant, which is absolutely we all like to think that we have control over ourselves, but these little birds, their behavior in building nests is absolutely genetically determined on this one really cool piece of it. So anyway, in case you've never seen the Murderous Millinery, these are hummingbird earrings and a hummingbird necklace from London in about 100 years ago. I can give a whole talk on that topic. And mounting the hummingbirds' heads upside down on the necklace to give you different colors is particularly barbarous, but fascinating. And I just want to close with a little piece. The white-necked Jacobin is one of my favorite stories I've run across. And why is it called the Jacobin? And the first time, this used to be called the collared or the white-necked hummingbird. But in 1779, Lecomte de Buffon, who is basically the great competitor with Linnaeus, calls them l'oiseau mouche à collier dit la Jacobine. All of a sudden, he changes it to being called the Jacobin. Why? Well, this is the Jacobin Club. Maximilien Robespierre might ring a bell. Louis-Antoine de Saint-Just. These are some French intellectuals going into the French Revolution where their club has a particular outfit. And if you look at this outfit, you can perhaps see why the Jacobin is called a Jacobin. The important thing about the history of this is, thank God the little bird is not extinct. Unlike in the French Revolution, when the Reign of Terror hit, the Jacobins went extinct. All of them, including Louis Antoine de Saint-Just, who was the archangel of the Reign of Terror, were all victims of the Reign of Terror. So thank you for your time. I just wanted to conclude that even complex hummingbird behaviors are genetically encoded. Jacobins are not topazes. That's just a grouchy thing. And I think hummingbirds are really cool. And thank you to my wife for putting up with me for this, to McGuire et al. For their 2014 phylogenetic tree, to the Macaulay Library for enabling this sort of stuff, this sort of research, and photographer credits to all the various people I've asked to help share really impossible pictures to take on purpose. To my parents who exposed me to nature, whether I liked it or not, and to some spectacularly talented guides in Peru, Colombia, and Brazil who really got me onto some of these birds in ways that I never would have been able to without help. So with that, I'll happily take questions.